So I think we're ready. Welcome everybody to our conversation about Ohnmacht as a public feeling with queer feminist, affect studies scholar Ann Cvetkovich. My name is Dijana Simić, and together with my colleague Whybrew, who is sitting here next to me, and Silvia Schultermantel and Jana Adesin, who are in Germany now, I was part of the Intimate Readings research group based here in Graz. At the peak of the pandemic, it was in the year 2021, we organized an online conference on effective world making, during which we already had the pleasure of having our first discussion with Ann. Therefore, this is Ann's second time being here in Graz and our second virtual encounter. That being said, there is a saying in both English as well as in German, third time's a charm. So hopefully, Ann, we will be able to see each other a third time in person soon. And we will get the chance to show you our city. And speaking in effective terms, you will also get the chance to get a feel about and for being in Graz. Before we start, I would like to use this opportunity to thank you for joining us and also to thank our colleagues from Forum Stadtpark to invite us, Sai and me, to moderate today's talk. So what do we have ahead of us? We have a lot of time. We have approximately 2 hours, and I will just give you a short orientation so you know what we have ahead of us. I will say a few introductory words about affect studies and also about Ann Cvetkovich's work. And then we will proceed to have a conversation about Ohnmacht as a public feeling, first amongst the three of us. And then finally, we will open up the floor for questions, comments from the audience. And at this point, I would also like to stress, our colleagues also mentioned it before, you have the possibility also to ask your questions and to state your comments in German. If you feel more comfortable this way, we will be able to provide English translations. So what is affect studies? And what can affect studies contribute to our reflections about Ohnmacht in political terms, in theoretical terms, but also in practical terms? Affect studies is a research field that emerged in the 1990s out of a critique of post-structuralist discussions about discourse, about language, and the deconstruction of power relations and power structures by shifting the focus back to more material questions, to questions that are connected to the body, to questions of bodies in connection, and also to the discussion of emotions or affects as embodied phenomena. Affect studies has many branches. It reaches from phenomenologies of embodiment to neuro and cognitive sciences. It is part of philosophy and cultural studies. And Ann Cvetkovich and her fellow travelers, as they call themselves, from the Public Feelings group in Austin and the Field Tank in Chicago, they belong to a branch of affect studies that grew out of feminist thinking. And their reflections are influenced by the feminist idea that the personal is political. So emotions are to be considered not only as personal and individual phenomena, but as political and public ones. Their approach is best illustrated, we believe, by Field Tank Chicago's slogan, "Depressed, it might be political," which also influenced Ann Cvetkovich's latest book, Depression, a Public Feeling, published in 2012. Ann Cvetkovich is a professor at the Feminist Institute of Social Transformation at Carleton University in Ottawa in Canada. Currently, she's on a sabbatical, so we are even more pleased and more thrilled that she's taking the time to share her insights with us, to have an exchange with us. Ann's research is located at the intersection of academia, activism, and art. She combines personal reflections with theoretical reflections and also with cultural and literary analysis. In her first monograph, with the title Mixed Feelings, which was published in 1992, she investigated the connections between feminism, mass culture, and Victorian sensationalism. Later on in her second book, which is titled The Archive of Feelings, or An Archive of Feeling, it's getting already emotional here. In her second book, which is titled An Archetypal Feeling, which was published approximately 10 years later in 2003, she was dealing with queer and especially lesbian trauma cultures and how they manifest themselves in the public. However, for us, her third book about depression as a public feeling seems to be the most interesting or most important one, because it gives us impulses to think about Ohnmacht as a public feeling, and has also published several edited collections, numerous articles, also art installations. I will not be able to name all of them, but I will just say that she's currently working on the creative use of LGBTQIA archives by artists and how we can conceptualize and understand them as counter archives that intervene in public histories. So once again, Anne, thank you for joining us and welcome back to Graz.
I'm really happy this worked out. It's perfect. I'll explain some of the reasons why as we go.
Oh, okay, so you want to do that. As Dijana already mentioned, you wrote a book, Depression and Public Feeling, and you developed your idea of depression as a public feeling in connection with the field tank Chicago's discussion on political depression after 9/11, the US invasion of Iraq, and the so-called war on terror, and the accompanying feelings of resignation and overwhelmedness among leftist US circles. And in connection with this, we wanted to ask you, as a kind of introduction, how did you deal with this feeling of being overwhelmed back then around the events of 9/11 and the war on terror? And which forms of political action and collective practices did the Public Feelings Project in Austin and the field tank Chicago develop at the time to deal with the situation, and to deal with the feeling of being overwhelmed by the political context of the political events at the time?
Thank you. I realized I should, before you launched into the question, I should have said a little bit of context setting. So I think I'll do that first and then jump in. I don't know, are you able, I guess you can't, because we're not on a conventional Zoom. I'm just wondering if you have a way to give people the questions in German as well as English. I'm just I'm grateful to be able to do this in English, but keep striving for language accessibility for people and not to presume always English as the primary language. Although my very sketchy beginner's German was not enough to allow me to understand, though it sounded like the very interesting opening remarks, kind of setting the scene for how you're understanding this category of Ohnmacht. So I hope we can, continue to unpack that as well. Anyway, I'm coming to you as it says on my name line, but probably you can't read it from the audience. I'm on Algonquin territory, which is otherwise known as Ottawa, the capital of Canada today. It's a sunny Saturday morning, and I've been back in Canada for about a week after 3 months away. Finally been in New York for an extended period, and also actually for the last 3 weeks in a way that I think will feed into our conversation in Europe. So I was able to go to Athens, Greece for the first time, and then was also in Copenhagen, Denmark for a seminar on the history of HIV/AIDS in Denmark, and then in England, in London, to present work that I'm doing on care and embodiment, which will come into our discussion today. And also to do some workshops on feelings and writing. So I feel very primed for this conversation. It was interesting, for example, to be in both Southern and Northern Europe, and then also to be in London for the first time since Brexit. So very big changes there in terms of the history, future of the UK, and the nature of the European Union. So it's just, I feel very grateful for the travel. I wish I could be with you in person, but even making the connection via Zoom is valuable because I think, as will come clear in our discussions, I'll get to your first question in a moment, context is very important. And we are dealing with certain kinds of global contexts, the pandemic for one, that has connected all of us through a shared relation to a virus that knows no borders. Also, as a result of the decline of capitalism, which I think was being discussed in the opening remarks as well, like what is our analysis of capitalism? And I appreciated that you began the introduction for me with kind of outlining affect studies and what does affect studies have to contribute, because I think creating a forum around a feeling, Ohnmacht, with the aim of diagnosing kind of what ails us and what do we need politically, I think speaks to a kind of 21st century interest in the way in which affect might be important to understanding political failures across the centuries, right? Going back to, at the very least, the democratizing and revolutionary politics of the 18th and 19th century. I'm saying this because for a European audience, I think this is very clear or very important to understand ourselves within the orbit of the rise of capitalism, the potential decline of capitalism, the modern production of something we might call democracy. And I think right now we're in a severe crisis of whether we ever had a democracy, whether we'll ever get one, whether that's even the goal we want. You know, and I'm thinking about, for me, for all of us as radical thinkers, the important legacy actually of certain German language writers, I think specifically about Marx and about Freud, and that shared legacy that we might have across languages. And so what does it mean for affect to be added into those legacies for radical and critical thinking? I know your narrative of affect studies began with post-structuralism, but I'm wanting to place it within that, that longer history as well as part of our discussion. So I was mentioning that by way of just talking about our capacity to travel and move and have these discussions. I'm grateful for that. And I also wanted to say that it's, I need to put it in my biography, but I actually, as a result of this sabbatical, I'm not only working on the book that is about archives and activism, but also working on a small book, which is tentatively called How to Live in a Body, a Survival Guide for Troubled Times, in which I'm seeking to look at certain keywords for our times, among them care. And this, you know, it comes out of affect, like an interest in whether and how. I'm sure we'll talk about it. I think you even mentioned care in your questions, and particularly a distinction between self-care and collective or radical care that has been troubling to many activists and theorists. So I think your interest in my work stems from what I might be able to offer by way of thinking about the politics of care. I'm also very interested in madness and disability, so different kinds of accommodations. So I think this does relate to the notion of political depression and thinking about mental health issues as not only public health issues, but political issues. And as a teacher, I've been very concerned about what's called the mental health crisis, both in academia and more generally, particularly for young people, but for everyone. This is, again, a global health crisis, I would say. And so my book is also an attempt to perhaps shed some light on how we might handle that, including, should we embrace madness and crip identities? Queer strategies are very important for that as well. And then I'm also interested in returning to questions of trauma, even though I've been critical of the category of trauma, as I am critical of the category of depression in both of my books, particularly medical categories. At the same time, the category of trauma doesn't go away, and the experience of trauma doesn't go away. So I'm attempting to address that issue. And yeah, come up with some possible tools for living from the tools that I have as a thinker. So that's why I said the timing is good, even though it's a Saturday morning here in Canada. And, in the interest of not overworking, I've been trying to make sure I don't do work on the weekends. But again, as you said, also I'm on sabbatical, it just seemed like this would be a good opportunity to brainstorm about some of the things that I am working on. Okay, so now I'm going to get to your first question, which is
I can actually repeat it and rephrase it a little based on what you said.
Yeah, please.
First of all, thank you again for joining us, even though it is a weekend. Yes. So originally I asked you in relation to the idea of depression as a public feeling and its connections to 9/11, the war on terror, and the invasion of Iraq. I think we can also nicely connect this with what you said about trauma. Because the connection between political overwhelmness, numbness, and the idea of dealing with it in a situation of collective trauma. I think this also, of course, can be connected to our collective experience of the pandemic and how we deal with that and being overwhelmed with the situation. But historically, of course, the ideas come out of the thinking around 9/11. So that's why we brought that up to kind of give a bit of an historical background. But the questions, I think, also connect to the political present and mostly the idea of how you dealt back then with being overwhelmed by the political situation, and also what we might take from that today, and which forms of political action and collective practice we develop or we continue to develop, both in the public feelings group, but also the field like Chicago and in your movement.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you're right or it's useful maybe to bring the category of trauma in, although in keeping too with the focus on depression, I'm always interested in what is the relation between sort of the big geopolitical forces that we might call trauma and the lived experience that can take the form of just very everyday kinds of affect. So indeed, this is interesting to think about a category like Ohnmacht in relation to a category like trauma. How is trauma lived in the experience of something we might call Ohnmacht? And I'm continuing to use the German because it's helpful for me even to defamiliarize the category from my English. Also because the translation to English is a bit, to my mind, introduces some different meanings, because typically you would translate it as powerlessness. But if you translate more literally, I think it would be without power, which I actually like better, because without power, it actually implies less of a internal responsibility. We've just been having all of these climate change induced storms, and people have been without power, i.e. electrical power, for a number of days. And of course, we wouldn't say that they're being without power is their own fault, right? It's a result of circumstances beyond their control. Whereas I think powerlessness implies something more internal, like there's something wrong with you, or what are you going to do to jumpstart your own system? And so it places more blame or more responsibility on the person who's having the feelings. So I actually like Ohnmacht as a way of signifying that this is a something that, you know, comes from somewhere else. So just a little note about translation there. So you sketched out this question of the origins of public feelings, field tank, and the concept of political depression in the wake of September 11th. And that is correct. Interesting to think about that as, on the one hand, again, a very American context, but one that has had very extreme global impact, and tied also to a war on terrorism, an increase in the security state that I think we now take for granted. And in the US electoral politics system, the ongoing Bush presidencies, perhaps a brief reprieve with the Obama presidency, but then the election of Trump in 2016. So it is interesting to look back at these first 2 decades of the 21st century. We're heading towards a full quarter century to see what has changed and what has not. So it's been interesting to me to see that. And I sense this also in making presentations like this one, that the category of political depression has retained its saliency across a range of different political events and times. So as you know, one would say in French, plus que ça change, plus c'est la même chose, that it seems to have a kind of constancy that is in its own way depressing. So it's also interesting to see if new affect categories do come up for the present conditions. And so I'm liking Ohnmacht as maybe another way around it. You mentioned some other ones in it that we may get to, such as overwhelm. I definitely think that's something that's going on right now as well. And connected to a sense of powerlessness is, and this I hope we'll talk about more too, is a sense of not knowing, like not knowing what to do. And one point I'll try to get across, I'll just preview it now, is that I do think for those of us on the left are trying to make change, part of the aim is to increase our tolerance for not knowing, to not let it incapacitate us, because in fact, sometimes it is the quest for certainty that is producing very conservative or right-wing tendencies to just like hold on and not be able to move flexibly with forms of change. So just to go back to the markers, you put in the question 9/11, US invasion of Iraq. We could put Afghanistan in there now. And of course, the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan just recently was indication not of success, but failure. So the fact that those regions continue to be marked in devastating ways by the impact of events post 9/11, although again, in the interest of longer histories, it's important to note the way in which the effects of colonialism are such that there has been devastating trauma in those regions long prior to 9/11. So these are about ongoing histories and then immediate histories, the war on terror, and accompanied feelings of resignation and overwhelmedness. So I just wanted to note that specificity as part of our discussion. I know in the next question, you're going to include a list of sort of contemporary reference points. And one thing that I wanted to be sure to flag for us to discuss is, what might be the particularly Austrian points of view, or the point of view from Graz, if you don't want to think just in national terms, or regionally within Europe, what are the trauma histories that are working themselves out in contemporary feelings of Ohnmacht. And here too, some of us have shared histories in the Balkans. So I would just also mention the legacy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the shiftings of borders across the 20th century in Europe that I think are also still having an impact today. So that I'm always interested to have that cross-regional discussion. So you asked me what we did back then. It's funny to have to remember. And, some of it is just like the same things that I'm doing now that we'll again talk about in response to many of the questions. I am an activist, but I am also a scholar. My tools tend to be communication, speaking, and writing. And so one of the things we did, which has continued to be a resource over these last 20 years, was simply to gather together in order to read, to talk, to write. It's a modest tool, but it has been an effective one. In fact, it was very active for me during the pandemic, that I was in Ottawa, having moved to Canada a few years ago, and through the powers of Zoom was able to connect with my Austin Field Tank group and to write with them and to meet monthly. We're still doing that. And in fact, when I met with you remotely before, I read materials that had been generated out of that group as we were trying to think through what the pandemic might mean. And so that's definitely a humble tool, but I think a powerful one. I think one theme for our discussion will be how do we address feelings of Ohnmacht through building relationships and forms of connection by whatever means are available to us. The activity is less important than the form of the building of relationship. And so we'll keep talking about that, but anything to do with building relationships and collectivity, I believe in the power of the cell, speaking back to forms of leftist organizing or underground organizing, in which small groups come together in insurgent ways, and that making things together, whether it's making a meal together, I think eating together, celebrating together is really important, building something together, an object, or in a more intangible way, making ideas together. I'll just say too, I love that this event, I wish I could be there, is ending with a dance party, because I think that's also very smart in your programming, after all the talking and the ideas, to actually just have bodies come together in the space and just not necessarily be talking to each other, but to be communicating through a bodily relatedness. But yeah, as we move into the next question, I just want to flag that issue of what are the events, macro and micro, that might be structuring our feelings. And then also, I think we're going to get into questions about also the cultural specificity of the strategies that we use in order to address those feelings. But to me, even thinking in those terms about what are the feelings of activism, what are the feelings of responding to the political situation, is very much indebted to feminist organizing. And then I'll also want to add queer organizing. So I don't think we could have come up with this notion of depression as a public feeling had we not, many of us had strong ties to HIV, AIDS, and queer organizing from the 80s and the 90s that also gave us a vocabulary for thinking about feelings as part of political life, because we were dealing with so much grief and loss, and also various forms of queer possibility for joy, including a lot of dance parties.
Yeah, definitely. We will be able to connect all of those feelings through our discussion. So you said in the beginning context is important, and you also highlighted this now. Maybe I would just like to ask you to also tell us about the depressed inns that you organized during that time. I believe that this is a very interesting form of gathering, and this is something that we could have also practiced here, putting on our bathrobes, coming together. Maybe you could just illustrate that so we have a very concrete example of how those cells were working back then after 9/11 in the US context.
And that is really, in some ways I can't speak to it directly. I want to give props to my Field Tank Chicago colleagues, particularly Lauren Berlant, who's no longer with us, but also Debbie Gould, and Mary Patton, Greg Bordowitz, others. So yeah, they came up with this idea that activism and depression did not have to be contradictions in terms, because you could show up to the demonstration in your bathrobe and indicate your tiredness. And again, I think that is definitely some queer camp sensibility at work in organizing in that way, and just making it possible to think creatively and think with humor about not having to show up in any particular way, right? Sometimes we have an image of an activist, which I think can also be very masculinist, kind of a warrior who always has power, right? Is never feeling vulnerable or weak. And so that image of the activist in a bathrobe is a really wonderful way to rethink what we mean by a demonstration.
We really enjoyed this picture that it also created, and it's also visible online if you look it up, those in the audience who are interested. And now let's shift from this, let's say, context where affect studies as a feminist and queer endeavor arose in the US context after 9/11. Let's go to today's world, 20 years later, in a time that is still pandemic, maybe already post-pandemic. We see that we are still confronted with different crises, political, economic, and so on. We have already been mentioning some of those. The things that are, I believe, most feelable for us here in Europe is Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, but also the military conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan that has been reactivated, war in Syria, brutal oppression in Afghanistan, Iran, and so on. So this is what we are dealing with right now. And similar to 9/11 in the US context, this gives us, especially on the left, a feeling of disappointment that our long-held convictions about democratization, emancipation, and so on somewhat were disappointed. Is this being prolonged now? This feeling of political depression, where do you see the connections between being overwhelmed then, being overwhelmed now, to somehow, try to take into account today's world and how these things developed, especially also with not forgetting the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you. And this is where I wish I were with you, so we, even could have like breakout groups in order to generate lists, like what are on people's lists of the things that are most affecting them. So I thought your list was really interesting. Certainly, yes, the Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is something that's very much in the headlines everywhere, certainly in North America, but it's very close to your borders. So I would be interested to hear about that. Also, I think still living in the legacy of war in Syria and the fact that the refugee crisis has meant this movement of refugees across European terrain, and then the closing of borders. I don't know what's happened in Austria, and this was happening before pandemic. I was always interested to talk to people about what was happening and the way in which even efforts to house and take in refugees were increasing forms of xenophobia and racism, particularly in Germany. I was hearing about that. So this, I think, is also a sign of our times, is the increase of racism and forms of moral panic on racialized lines as a result of the fraying of the social welfare system, so that people feel less like they have things to give. This is, I mean, this was the conversation I was having in Denmark 2 weeks ago, because of it's just less money, right, to be able to support people, or the what's going on in France right now with the retirement age and the way in which that is being seen as a fault line with regard to the social welfare system. So I watch this with interest because I think it is a place where we're seeing a lot of hostility. Brexit is also very much about that, right? That we don't want other people coming in, using up our resources. So we're going to have like Britain for British people only. So racism is huge, and racism is a huge issue in the US and in Canada as well. I mentioned mental health issues, gun violence, one of the forms of kind of ordinary, powerlessness and violence is just rampant. Gun violence. I mean, this is kind of ordinary warfare inside this. Like, you don't even have to oppress people; they're just like doing it themselves, because you have all this internalized violence, and of course the horrific legal battles right now around gender and trans issues, which are another example of scapegoating. Also very much connects to what I was saying about certainty and uncertainty. So this desire for like stable gender binaries and against anything that messes with that is another place where you can, I think, see an affective politics going on that is very depressing and disruptive, in part because we're seeing what we thought were gains turn into liabilities over time. So that's another potent force, I think, in this feeling that we're going backwards, not forwards. And that, I think, is something I'm interested in trying to address effectively through this these concepts like political depression or Ohnmacht. Is how can we just admit that, throw it out on the table and say, how do we move forward with no guarantees, right? No narrative that can sustain us around a vision of revolution, a vision of social democracy, that we do not have that narrative anymore. And so we have to invent a kind of collectivity or vision for the future in very different terms. I'll mention also climate change, because I think that too is producing a sense of overwhelm or Ohnmacht, right? Because it feels sort of beyond individual people or governments. Like, we are really looking at the loss of the planet, or I mean, it may be that the planet survives and humans do not. Maybe that's a good thing, but that it casts a large shadow over all of the other things, and I'll also, I think about fraying infrastructure, because just in Ottawa here, we had a huge storm last year. I know there's been flooding of various kinds in Europe. Just the cleanup from those storms puts so much pressure on available infrastructures that it also leaves people feeling really anxious. Like, what happens, if the communication system breaks down? What happens if you're without power for 10 days, as I was last May? And that this is an increasingly common situation is something that is also, I think, we're looking at the impact of climate change right now, right away, in terms of a proliferation of small scale disasters that require huge resources to be able to fix. And how long can we do that without having a kind of burnout of like loss of power, let's say, of the entire system, not just individuals within it? I mean, that's my like taking the temperature current moment. And I would love to hear what any of you have to say about that, but it is this sort of comparing notes on like, what are the things affecting you? And then of course, trying to think about them collectively or together as part of one systemic analysis, for better or worse.
Picked up a lot of interesting ideas, particularly a connection to the idea of what happens if our narratives of political progress are disrupted, what turned against us, and the idea of rupture, breakage, and also in a kind of a way, the idea of progress and offering a solution being part of powerlessness and political overwhelmedness, and how to deal with that. And you also picked up on the idea of community and which role that can play. And with our next question, we'd like to invite you to address this a little further, namely, what role you see for practices of both self, but also in particular communal care, and the idea of mutual sharing and shared attachment. So finding things to hold on to and holding on to one another, and the idea of sharing both emotionally, but also generationally and intergenerationally, and the role that rituals of collective and shared mourning might play in this, particularly with this idea that we had a narrative of progress, or we had a lot of narratives of progress that are now disrupted and turned against us in a very short amount of time. So it was a very slow progress, particularly towards queer rights over the last couple of decades. And now we're seeing it being rolled back in a very quick manner. And of course, that brings along certain feelings of mourning and loss as well. You also touched in the beginning on the importance of reading and writing in this context, and the accompanying act of community building that you mentioned there, and of building relationships that help us to sustain momentum, help us to sustain hope, help us to sustain and counteract feelings of overwhelmness, hopelessness, and things like that. So I'd like to invite you to, build on that.
And this is probably a good shift of emphasis as we spent our conversation so far kind of diagnosing all the things that are wrong. So now we can move into the question of, well, what can we do? And certainly I think it's one reason why people have been consulting my work, in hopes that it provides a path through, if not out. And it's part of the reason for this, what feels like the relevance of this book I'm working on now about care. So I'll just repeat a little bit something that I said earlier, so that we can continue to unpack it. And that is the the value of anything that produces collectivity, regardless of the activity. So reading and writing is certainly one of those for people like me, but not the only thing. In fact, I think your question, that a lot of the questions, I'll just say for the audience, are very interesting and elegant ones. So I hope you'll, I don't know, publish them in some way, because Dijana and Sai put a lot of work into them. And in fact, your questions in a sense are like answers, right? So your language proposes things like attachment, care, sharing, rituals of sharing, relationship, community building. I mean, all of that language, I think, is really valuable. And I think we are able to, even with all of the disappointments and failures of the large-scale narratives we've had for social change are a reality, I think we can still turn to what may seem like smaller scale, and will be important to talk about that question of scale, that we still have that available to us. I think of a volume that was produced out of a group based in Santa Cruz, Anna Cvetkovich, who's an anthropologist working in the tradition of Donna Haraway, but I think there was also a Scandinavian group involved as well. And they produced a volume called The Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet. So it's like, how do we craft art from within the damage? So we recognize the damage, but that doesn't stop us. So that's, I think, what we're trying to reflect on here today. And even just an event like the one that's organized for today, right? That looks like it's in a nice location. You know, you'll have some
next time, and next time you will see.
Yeah. You'll have some dancing. Hopefully there'll be some food, you know, that kind of retreat from the demands of daily life. You know, often people will say that. I did an event, in a reading group event in London last week, and I was pleased that at the end people said, "Oh, thank you. You know, I was glad to just like sit thinking about ideas for a while." They had just been having issues around striking and labor. A lot of people were really stressed out, you know, they're ending their term and so on. And so just to take that time out was good. Or when I was in Denmark, it was really lovely. Fortunately, I guess the state is still able to fund research groups. And so, you know, they had the money to bring two of us in to act as commenters on the work that the research group of 8 people were doing. They're collectively writing a history of HIV/AIDS in Denmark, but also as part of the grant doing individual work that's related to that. So we were able to spend 2 days together, and we went to a small inn at the seaside, and we had amazing food. You know, we had it organized so the facilitator had us go for walks on the beach, you know, take time out for cake and so on. And just something like that can be very hope building and rejuvenating. So that's also why I like to run workshops where I get people to write as well as talking to each other. And that too can be a way of allowing people to see that they, you know, I think the key for this idea of feeling that you are without power or Ohnmacht is to be in situations where you recognize that your feelings matter, your ideas matter, and that is the source of not only your own power, but any kind of power that a movement is going to have. And in fact, even if what you bring to the table is, I'm exhausted, as in the political depression protests, that too is, your truth and is a reality that you bring to the table that has a kind of energy to it, even if it seems like it's the energy of no energy. So staging and facilitating like rituals or gatherings where people can bring themselves to the table, I think is our tool that we have for organizing and for survival in this incredibly damaged time.
And
I'd actually like to pick up on that again and dig a little deeper into that. Because so far we've mostly talked about Ohnmacht as something disabling. And now kind of is the question, how can we reclaim Ohnmacht? How can we reframe it? How can we overcome it? How can we actually regain strength from our collective experience of Ohnmacht?
Yeah. Well, do you want to, I'm looking at our little loose script here. And I'm wondering if, as part of that,
or maybe I can add here at this point, because you already also mentioned some things that you termed now low scale possibilities of acting. And you term this in your book on depression as a public feeling. You speak of the utopia of the everyday habit. So these small things, small scale things we can do. You already mentioned a few of them, like meeting people, writing, also taking care of yourself, taking a rest, and so on. And the idea is to use those small steps to think about how we can deal with big systemic issues like capitalism, racism, and so on. So maybe you can tell us a little more about that, about the examples you use, what is the utopia of everyday habit? And also we would like to ask you to also take into account questions of privilege. So who can actually afford to take a rest? Who can afford to, who has the privilege to sit down and write? And who can do something, who can do nothing? And is this something, the utopia of everyday habit, that is only individual, and how can we do it collectively?
Yeah, so I'm just thinking, I was in the questions you gave me, that there's the utopia of everyday habit, which is a phrase from the depression book that I used to describe some of these kind of small scale activities like journaling, crafts, yoga. And we want to talk about the question of privilege. But I think before we do that, we should loop in this discussion about rest and napping as a form of resistance, because I think that's a good example of this point that Sai was making about what are the mechanisms whereby Ohnmacht is not just debility, but also strength or power. And I just wanted to hear a bit from, so there's been a very interesting development on the part of especially Black feminists in the US to think about rest as resistance. It comes partly from the way in which Audre Lorde's work on caring for myself as an act of resistance has also been taken up and integrated into especially Black Lives Matter organizing, which has been largely catalyzed by feminist and queer women who have made sure that we think about affect as part of activism, and in which there is a lot of checking in and self-care and kind of affective care as part of activism. So there's actually a woman who has something called the Nap Ministry. There was just recently an installation that I was able to visit at the Metropolitan, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where there was a nap room, a Black feminist nap room. It was open to all, but it had been designed with the needs of Black women in mind. where they are making this point about rest is radical, and also creating, in the spirit of the bathrobe demonstrations around political depression, creating public space for people to rest together. And of course, to some extent, that's also what practices like yoga are as well, right? Where one of the most important parts of a yoga class is actually shavasana, which is the resting at the end in a group of people. So I was very interested that you mentioned in your question that a group of women in Zagreb had taken up this strategy for protest as well, and that it even has origins in anti-fascism in Yugoslavia from the 1950s, because it suggests that there's a variety of different kind of cultural specificities to radical rest. Can you just tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I hope you're not frozen now. So when thinking about how taking a rest can be political, we can think about it in different contexts. And you already mentioned Audre Lorde and her famous idea of self-care not being self-indulgence, but being a part of so-called political warfare. And we have seen something similar develop in Zagreb in 2021. So this was, again, the peak of the pandemic, and it was not able for people to gather for the 8th of March protests. And so feminist activists who would usually have organized the 8th of March protest were calling people to take a rest. And they were sending out invitations to do so. In Croatian, it's odmor je otpor, taking a rest is resistance. And this actually goes back to advice that was given out by Women's Anti-Fascist Front in Yugoslavia in the 1950s in their journal, where they were actually publishing pictures of women laying down horizontally and advising them to take a rest after their paid and unpaid work. And so it's basically going back to the history we have and we know from our own local context in order to see how we can use these strategies in today's world and how we can be resistant by doing nothing. And what happened then is actually that it was a call to take a rest and to take a picture of that and put it online. So you would have your Instagram profile and Facebook profile and whatever social media you use be flooded with pictures of people drinking a glass of wine, lying in a bathtub and so on, and doing this for the 8th of March, where they would usually organize something, do something big, but they were actually concentrating maybe on what we might call here also the utopia of everyday happiness. So just take a bath, take a rest, and take care of yourself.
No, I think that's fascinating. And I'm also very intrigued to think about there being other lineages besides the Black feminist one that I'm familiar with for this kind of model of rest, in part because it addresses to the question about privilege. So, under what circumstances is rest radical because it has been denied to people. So one of the premises for Black feminist organizing about rest is to even just quote the medical statistics on the amount of work that Black women typically do. And this would apply to other racialized women as well. And also even the sleep statistics, because sleep is a key indicator for health, right? So if people are sleeping less, they're more likely to be less healthy. And again, the stats, at least within the US, for health outcomes and life expectancy are very much refracted along racial lines. I'm also thinking, so thank you for clarifying that the nature of the protest was one where people weren't coming together to put their little mats down and rest together, although that is certainly a model, and that's what's going on with some of these public rest spaces. But it's also one of the things that internet activism can make possible, is that people can find ways to produce a collective impact from the photos they take in the privacy of their own homes and so on. And I do want to mention another lineage for that notion of rest as resistance, which is coming from disability politics and particularly queer crip politics, where it's been pointed out that not every, this is again goes back to the sort of cliche image of the activist as kind of a warrior that traffics in stereotypes of, let's say, able-bodied masculinity. It's a bit like the activist as soldier. And so disability activists have pointed out that that is not always available to everyone to show up for the protest, that some people may have less mobility because of chronic illness. You know, it may be that the demonstration is not accessible for folks in wheelchairs or with other assisted devices. And so in that case, you know, building a protest community that includes the possibility of staying at home as another way of contributing to protest has for me been a really important piece to add into the mix. So I think it's coming from a lot of different directions. And with regard to the question of privilege, I think it's definitely important to be mindful of, you know, who needs to rest. Like in some cases, for example, in the academy where I work, I do feel it's incumbent on white allies to step up to the plate and make sure that people of color are not doing a disproportionate amount of the work around anti-racism. So in some cases, it involves being willing to do more work so others can do less. On the other hand, and I think I did hear amidst the German this being addressed in the opening remarks, was the question of neoliberal models of productivity under capitalism and the way in which even so-called privileged people are no longer gaining access to the forms of rest that were part of the promise of social democracy and the welfare state, that people are, you know, working more hours in the day, they're on email all the time, they're not taking vacations in the way that they were, they're working for, you know, more years rather than retiring earlier. So even the economic privileges of, you know, waged labor and middle-class life are no longer allowing for rest. This is particularly true in the US, but again, this is why I watch with interest the differences between European countries or Canada, where I live, where you have universal health care and you have more protections, versus the US, where there's this kind of free enterprise system where everyone just works their asses off in, you know, the gig economy or whatever. You know, academia, we're working more and more and more. And so we're not resting either. So it's kind of like the need for rest exists across the spectrum of different nations and different social classes. Hence the need for this, you know, utopia of everyday habit that includes these forms of activity that can be more oriented towards rest. Do I see you looking at the time?
Oh, we're looking at the time, but don't worry. We have
Okay.
another time.
No, I think we're good. And we can.
I really like the idea of time you just brought up, particularly the idea of normative time and
Yeah.
expectations of productivity, and the idea of giving and reclaiming space, particularly from marginalized communities, and who gets to have space to rest and who has to reclaim it. And also the idea of the role of hope that it might be in there, and the role of anti-normative security and resistant practices of making worlds and spaces together, and the longing for a better world. So I wanted to borrow from Jose Munoz and ask you what role might hope and anti-normative practices of futurity play in overcoming, as Munoz put it, the quagmire of the present, and what role might positive feelings like joy and love and associations of hope and longing for a better future play in dealing with overwhelmedness, political numbness, and powerlessness.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And, thank you for bringing up Jose's work, because he's also an important fellow traveler for the Field Tank and Public Feelings projects. We often had connections in New York through people like Jose and also Lisa Dugan. So I consider them to be another one of ourselves. And certainly at the times when we were gathering in the aughts, let's say like 08, 09, et cetera, we were all thinking about utopia. Jose was working on the Cruising Utopia book. And so there was a lot of that kind of talk, which also fed into my use of the term utopia of everyday habit. There is now too, definitely within the US, a emphasis on notions of Black joy. And then I've also in Canada been tracking discussions of Indigenous joy. So what does it mean for people who have been historically targeted for destruction and who still are dying or being assaulted in disproportionate numbers to still craft practices of joy? That is a real model. And I think for those of us who are white, it also is an important learning process, like in an ideally not an appropriative way, to nonetheless be open to or to be able to learn from the practices of joy and the cultural traditions, for example, of joy that has been crafted even in the context of enslavement, or other forms of historical violence. So this utopia piece, the joy piece, definitely important. I think where we're headed to, kind of as part of our, moving towards closing this part of our discussion, is this question of what I've called dialectics of hope and despair, or the relation between joy and unhappiness. We could bring Sarah Ahmed's work in here as well, like the feminist killjoy and the false promise of happiness. So what is the necessity for those of us on the more radical fringes of affect politics to insist on our unhappiness at the same time as we're also crafting non-normative practices of joy and happiness that don't fit normative models? So I think that's why the work by Jose and others on utopia has been so, and hope has been so important and remains very significant for us. Let's say, 10 years later, it's still really useful.
So thank you, Anne, for also mentioning your notion of the dialectics of hope and despair, because basically we started off with the idea of political depression, Ohnmacht, despair, and now we're trying to go into the direction of joy and how we can also understand those feelings as being very multifaceted and ambivalent, and also appreciate them as such. At this point, maybe it's the right time to open up the floor for discussions and comments from our audience to see what their thoughts are on Ohnmacht as a political phenomenon, as a public phenomenon. Where do you feel it? Which strategies do you have to deal with it? And which questions do you have for Anne in the comments? And thank you very much so far. There's a question.
Yeah, hello. Sorry. Okay. I think about the discussion now during the pandemic, but also when it comes to natural disaster prevention together with the climate change. I made an observation, let's put it this way, that if somebody prepares or has an anxiety to become a victim of natural disasters and prepares for it, yeah? Then it's often the case that in the discussion it's going, right, it's not an objective feeling you have, your anxiety, yeah? Because you may not experience this or that. So these are then called, these people are often then called as preppers. They are not solitary. They take resources which then may be not available to others. So a kind of selfish. Yeah? This is the group who doesn't want to become a victim. Yeah? And they have anxieties to become a victim. Yeah? My question is if solidarity and the call for collectivism also produces Ohnmacht as well as capitalistic mechanism. Because these people who prepare, they have the feeling of Ohnmacht because they are criticized that they prepare. Yeah? And I think a bit of this split in the Western societies we experience now is that different causes of Ohnmacht are not accepted from this side or the other side. Yeah? So there is maybe a foresight to the Ohnmacht. This is what I want to bring on the table. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for this. Are there preppers in Europe? I think of it as very US.
That might be connected, prepare for disaster that do come up. I don't think we have the traditional category of prepper in Europe, but there's definitely tendencies that might be connected.
Yeah, I mean, somehow I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I wonder why. Are you? That's okay. Yeah, this is an interesting question in a couple of different ways. First of all, we left off our discussion with this kind of dialectical back and forth. And I like to put it in there, especially for European audiences, because I do feel like it's part of the critical inheritance that I get, not only from Marx, but from Hegel. And I like to acknowledge that lineage as part of mine, but also as something that I've struggled with over time. And so I think that this more traditional notion of the dialectic, I also want to counterbalance with some of these new forms of thinking about affect, where something can be both one thing and another. So I find that in these discussions, we're always able to find counterexamples, like what about the preppers? And we have to acknowledge, I think, sometimes the difficulty we might have distinguishing between, on the one hand, a prepper, on the other hand, let's say an anarchist activist who is coming up with strategies of mutual aid, which in some cases can look very much like prepper ideology. For example, Octavia Butler, the sci-fi writer, who's been very much taken up by young activists in the US. And Sai, I know you've been writing about science fiction, so you might be able to speak to this, but within Octavia Butler's work, there's also the to-go bag, where you do have your materials ready for when the shit comes down. And I'm also a part of a tradition of lesbian feminist communities that's very DIY, do it yourself, around going back to the land, around being able to build for yourself, make a garden for yourself, create these sustainable communities that might be a good skill set for when trouble arises, and also can be a good resource in the present. So I think we're always going to have that issue. You know, it's also present in your questions about rest, like who has the privilege to rest and who doesn't, where we have to grapple with different kinds of prepping. But then I think the question was interesting as well for kind of talking about the affective dynamics of prepping in the context of disaster. Oh, I think hang on.
We can hear you very well.
Okay, you look like
You're just a little frozen.
Yeah, you were a little bit frozen. Sometimes if I stop my video, oh yeah, I see.
Oh, I think you're back now.
Okay. But the video is, I can see the video is, oh well, you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I just wanted to address this question of, well, I noticed you were maybe using in your language this idea of the fortress, like fortress.
Yes.
Ohnmacht. And so I'm thinking about also fortification and where is it good and where is it bad. So here I think maybe we come back to the question of vulnerability and what is a way of preparing but also remaining vulnerable, like recognizing that you can't fully protect yourself and that you are going to be vulnerable. So I think that might be an affective demeanor to be able to cultivate, is a vulnerability and a flexibility that is different from the fortification that says, you know, I'm going to get a gun, you know, I'm going to live off the grid and be in isolation. And this is also, again, where collectivity comes in.
Just because you asked for my input. I think the difference, and you also kind of already touched on it, is positionality again. Who's actually in danger and who is preparing for danger from a position of privilege. The preppers, unlike the character in the Octavia Butler book that you've mentioned, that character is in actual danger, both because she's a woman, but also because she's a Black woman, and she lives in a very dangerous world. Whereas preppers prepare for a danger that is not connected to any kind of discrimination. It is connected to conspiracy theories. So I think there's a differentiation between practices of communal care and communal preparedness that take into account particular forms of vulnerability and this preparing for a disaster from a position of privilege.
I like that.
Let's see if there are more questions and comments in the audience.
We have another, whoa, okay. We have another question, and maybe at this point we have to add somehow that we are preparing at Forum Stadtpark for November's event a leftist emancipatory prepper basement, where we're going to think artistically, humoristic, what would you actually prep in a solidarity way of thinking, in a collective way of thinking for a post-catastrophic kind of scenery. So yeah, invitation for that already. And here's the next question.
Hi, thank you, Anne, for being here with us. I have some reflections more than a question, or I just want to invite you to share your opinion on this. And it's very funny that you mentioned Octavia Butler just now, because I was going to ask you about that, because I was thinking what you said earlier about that we are kind of lacking narratives of like a better future, or like narratives of utopia. And how also the media that we consume and everything that we are reading also in feminist scholarship, sometimes it's very focused on critique and like very negative scenarios, dystopian books. And I just finished today the Octavia Butler, the Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Italians, and I'm devastated. I mean, I hated it so much. It's just so full of violence and horror. I can't take it anymore. And it's like, can we please have also feminist utopias, like nice books about let's imagine better futures together. And also a book that we were reading recently with some colleagues, A Feminist Theory of Violence. It was also saying, yeah, this book is an attempt to imagine an abolitionist, decolonial, feminist future, but then the utopia was not there. It was just critique. The whole book was critique. So then it's like, where's the utopia? Where is our feminist utopia? And how can we imagine it together? And I don't know, maybe I'm not looking at the right places, but I feel that we are lacking that a little bit, this kind of more positive, not in a naive way, but like some using some kind of futuristic imagination that can help us project some of this Ohnmacht feeling that we're having somewhere else. So I just wanted to hear what you think about this.
So I want to go in a couple of different directions. It's true that Octavia Butler can be quite dystopian, but on the other hand, I think she can be read in a way that is very encouraging, again, for this art of living in a damaged planet. I would recommend the podcast by Adrienne Marie Brown and Toshi Regan, who are two important Black feminists, that goes through the Octavia Butler chapter by chapter. There's just great secondary reading on Butler that's helpful for maybe adjusting your framework so that you do view that as utopian fiction. And this is also one thing I haven't mentioned as we've been talking. Wow. So I'm currently enrolled in this little study situation called Embodied Social Justice Institute. It's run by Angel Kyoto Williams, who's a Black Buddhist, and includes some amazing teachers that just started this past week. And it is also, I think, very important in providing tools for living, where the connection between embodiment and social justice is laid out in such a way that it really helps with this question of how the small scale or the self relates to the larger scale or the collective. So I encourage you to just Google some of that work, because you're not really on probably able to see the chat. I won't bother to put stuff in there. But for example, if you are going to have this prepper room in a future event, I would encourage you to include in the prepper package perhaps, some books, right, that include like a kind of instruction manual for good breathing and good somatic protocol. And for example, one book that we just got to hear a lecture on this week was from Patrisse Cullors, who's one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, and she has published a book called The Abolitionist's Handbook, and it takes you through these kind of 12 steps for abolition that include things like finding practices of joy, learning to kind of scan your body to understand how you're feeling, and so on. So I've just started this 3-month program, and I look forward to finding out more from it. But in addition to having reading material like that in the prepper or the to-go bag, I think too, in your basement, it would be interesting to assemble people and do practice together, like practices of preparedness for grounding in your body, so that fear does not become debilitating or because fear is also a huge piece of Ohnmacht, I think, right? That you're so panicked, like that you can't do anything, or you go into fright or flight mode that is part of a trauma response or a PTSD response, where you're just like hyper alert and you got to like do and like do things to protect yourself and so on, because you can't stand to be in any kind of state of fear or anxiety. So a lot of this embodiment somatic practice is about increasing what I think some therapists call your window of tolerance for discomfort. And that's also about vulnerability. So it's kind of taking a path towards addressing fear or powerlessness that, again, doesn't try to turn away from it or clamp down on it, but can kind of roll with it and not be debilitated by it. So I guess that would be also my plug for a certain way of reading Octavia Butler, which can be really hard, and not being freaked out by it, like not thinking utopia is going to look like, a certain way. I'll also recommend my friend Toshi Regan, who's a brilliant musician, who's done the podcast with Adrienne Maree Brown on Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, also has an opera version of Parable of the Sower. And I think in the musical version of Octavia Butler, it's also a bit easier to take because it comes into the body and it's in song. One of the pieces from it, one of the songs that I sometimes like to play in presentations is these lines that are from a song of her mother's, Bernice Johnson Regan, something like, there's a new world coming, everything's going to be changing or turning. Where are you going to be standing when it comes? So, it's kind of apocalyptic it's definitely coming out of Christian roots of like a new world coming, but it is also about apocalypse in the bad sense. And then this idea of where you're going to be standing when it comes, like how are you going to have this wave come over you and still be standing? And so we need somatic practices in order to be able to do that. So that I think has to be in our to-go bag. No one tool or object is going to protect you, although there's certainly some good tools to have. But one of the tools you can carry with you is your capacity to reground in your body.
I think also, you mentioned the to-go bag, and I think the protagonist doesn't just have to go back. Also, she has her narrative, her religious narrative that carries her on through this experience. So it, once again, as you highlighted before, shows the importance of writing, of finding your own narrative, and also the importance of hopeful narrative. So I think there's actually several narratives in Octavia Butler that work together. And there's the reality, and then facing the reality and how to face the reality in a caring and communal way.
Yeah. And in fact, the key teaching in the religion that she develops is God is change, change is God. And that too is what I'm suggesting is part of these learning practices, is to be able to accept change. Again, it's a practice. I find myself resisting it all the time, but it's so that's why it's a good one, because it's hard.
There are, I believe, more questions or comments.
There's one. In the meanwhile, I was just wondering if you, because what you, the three of you, are practicing right now. I mean, I really feel this urge as well, and this longing for utopian narratives. What you're doing or performing right here is the notion that you're also working with of reparative reading, I think. Maybe you can add some words on that, because sometimes even the utopian narratives are missing, but we can still draw some hope from, texts like these or maybe lost futures from the past. That aren't clear visions for the future, but still you can read texts in a more reparative way. Maybe you can share some words while I have them.
Yeah.
Change and finding a way to shape the change and survive in the change and making a living in the change and finding alternatives in change. So it's a lot about how in this novel, I'm not sure if everyone has read it, it's a lot about how there is societal change. Societal change is unavoidable and will not always be for the positive, but we can find ways of dealing with it. We can find alternative narrative, alternative approaches. We can build communities and find strength together. But there's always the confrontation with, and that's the idea of the negative and depressing part in the book. The idea of the negative there, that these hopeful dimensions are often disrupted because we live in a world of discrimination, we live in a world of violence. But there's also always this momentum of reclaiming, this finding hope in devastation, finding hope in challenging situations. And that's where I think the component comes in. And similarly, in reading practices, I think is where the reparative reading comes in. Even if there's narratives that might not include us, that might include violence, that might seem depressing at the first hand, there's elements that we can take and that we can build on to build new worlds, to build new connections, both in our discussions of the text, but also reading the text.
And I was also thinking about the notion of preparation when you stated your comment, because you said something like, I mean, I want something positive, but I don't want it to be naive. And we have come to understand these sorts of preparative readings and readings that are focusing on the positive as something that is naive. And this has to do with our academic upbringing, because we have been schooled by post-structuralism and this whole idea of deconstructing things, finding the problem, seeing what is wrong, and so on. And then we get lost in that. And definitely we need a more reparative approach. And this is something that we have been taking up within our joint project on effective world making, where we were basically carried by this idea of reparative reading, which comes from Simić. Some of you might know. For others, I believe it's something that is definitely worth looking into. And this is, these notions of reparative reading, if we cannot find the positive narrative per se, then we can try to at least approach a narrative in a more positive way. And this is where Ann's idea of the dialectics of hope and despair, I believe, come into place very, very nicely. And another term that we didn't mention through our discussion now is a term that we should also be somehow careful about, which is toxic positivity. So I believe we're not trying to say that we should all focus on the positive now and try to stick through, because this also has to do with this very classic neoliberal idea of, it's going to be better, just keep going, self-optimize yourself, and so on. So I believe we have to be very balanced in our reparative attempts to find positive and nourishing narratives. And I think we can do so by always having in mind this dialectics of hope and despair. So there's always, negatives to the positive and positives to the negative, and we should understand feelings in this very, very multifaceted ways.
Connect this back to this notion of Ohnmacht and reclaiming Ohnmacht. How can we take something that is overwhelming and practice it together, embrace the feeling, work on what can we learn from this feeling. So it's not necessarily about denying negative aspects, but acknowledging them and finding a way of addressing them and finding a way of maybe also establishing connection to them. So toxic positivity always has this focus on there is no problem. Reparative reading has there is the problem. Now let's deal with it. And now let's see what we can make out of the problem.
That was great to hear from the two of you on the question of the reparative. And I think it is important for us to underscore that and the way that it comes out of a lineage of queer theorizing, particularly in the questions you gave me. You were reminding us of how some of Eve Sedgwick's thinking about the reparative came specifically from depathologizing shame. that has been so present in queer politics. And so that's where I'm wanting to play with, and I think your questions helped me, these multiple lineages too of, let's say, Marxist cultural theory on dialectics of hope and despair, and queer understandings of the relation between critique and the reparative, particularly as it relates to affectively driven categories like shame. So what would happen if we worked on a more reparative relation to shame in our political movements, given that I think there is a lot of shaming that goes on. It's been a big part of sectarianism on the left, is like, you're doing it wrong, you know, and this is how you need to be. I just went to a panel yesterday about Communists in the Closet, a new book by Bettina Apteker about the tradition, particularly in the context of Stalinism, of purging of homosexuals from the Communist Party. And it was just a reminder of a legacy of both connections and differences between queer politics and left politics. So I'm really interested in how affect has been a driver for trying to think radical politics in some different ways. And we don't necessarily need to have a nostalgia for past revolutionary movements, because some of them have been very problematic. And so let us go forward and try to craft something different.
Let us go forward and see how many questions there are in the audience.
I think I have two small comments. The first one would be addressing again utopias in sci-fi, because I just currently was reading Jane Anderson, I think. And she was writing about a world that is where the quasi-fascist movement is winning, and the only moment of utopia is inside having a small community of people you care about and that you actually love, that belonging to live on despite all despair is kind of the utopian element. And the second thing is that I really liked the moment where you were talking about relaxation, and was thinking about how much anti-work movement was manifesting during Corona and the COVID in general worldwide. And especially in China, you had the movement which was called Tangping. So it's translated as lying down and or lying flat. And people in public spaces would just lie themselves down on the ground and stop doing anything. And they would do it in the trains, they would do it on the streets, they would do it in the supermarket, just somewhere. And they just stopped acting at all, just lie down, which is like a youth movement. And then there's the second movement that is called Bailan, that is coming out of it, which means, translated again, let it rot. So it's kind of the punk attitude of lying down, of just don't care about it at all and just let it rot. And I think that's maybe something we can do about lots of things that are going wrong.
Just let it rot.
I'm gonna let you keep taking questions or comments at this point. Yeah.
Are there other questions at this point?
Questions?
Yeah, and then we can start to slowly wrap it up in the next up to 15 minutes. There's one more question on the back.
Yeah, thanks a lot for all conversation until now. I took a lot of tips from this how to rest, and this is also what when I'm thinking about rest as a resistant, I'm also thinking about how many resources I need to do this resistance. And I wanted to two things actually. One thing is that this feeling of Ohnmacht it's not, it's very typical West feeling or let's say it's a European feeling, and it's also a consequence. It's not happening in vacuum. It's a consequence of 20-year radical process of losing a privilege. And this is something what is on a background of this feeling. And the opposite pole of this Ohnmacht is actually a radical fascization, in mean that excluding all groups to get more of own privilege because of that. So, and Ohnmacht is also not happening. We are not passive. We are extremely active. We are active in I don't know, destroying our environment. We are very active in reproducing power relations. We are and now with this turbulent and very fast moving society, that this acceleration and also predictivity in last 20 years raised a lot. It's actually also using all our resources only for reproduction. It's not only that we are working more, it's also that we are using also our private time or free time for like Didi said, self-optimierung, or if you are working in some precarious work, then it's even that you are exploiting your private resources in somehow to put them in economic capital. So here, I think this, I like very much, I don't know a lot, but through this conversation, a lot I got it from this politics of emotions. I think this is really a, it is something on what we can build, but resistance to build and struggle to build. And but I think it's on one side, not to think that as some passive thing. Also, what Lane said, to rest, it's nothing passive, but as an activity. On the other side, we need to also to be aware that that this is happening to us because we have also a radical change of society. And this all talking, I didn't read this book from Olivia something, but it is this struggle that we need to be also aware through this reflection. And also, I would say, you said about activism as this mythological or activism as also today it's also classical activism. I think we still need also this classical activism, and more here maybe a question how this is related, these two, because we have also active forces also for that are somehow trying to struggle against these tendencies in the massive, I would say, deprivileges, especially in Europe, is this happening? This is also something that we are now, since the last crisis, people are experiencing. This is also not a, it's also the rise of fascism is also so strong. Because actually it is losing the used standard, how to say, it's a material problem that everyone is feeling.
Thank you for these questions. I think we can put them together and listen to Ann's thoughts about this and then try to come to a conclusion.
Yeah, I do want to comment on this because I think that was a very interesting set of remarks that brings up some things that perhaps we haven't fully touched on. And so, among other things, what I found important in what you just said was this reminder about loss of privilege as part of the nexus of Ohnmacht. I think that's right. And I think, it necessitates a kind of caution around what it is that we are trying to achieve. I think, too, also this notion of rest as requiring resources is an interesting one, too. that we talked about with regard to privilege and rest. So this is where I think back when we were first discussing this event, I was also trying to think about the macht part of Ohnmacht, because again, yeah, the term power in English definitely has multiple valences or connotations. And I think macht also would translate sometimes into might as power, that again might be a form of power that in fact we want to be critical of. So I'm thinking too that it might involve a different terminology, but I think when I'm describing things like this at work on embodiment, it's less about power in the conventional sense of like puffed up, I don't know, patriarchy, and maybe more about energy. So developing energy internally in a sustainable way. I'm just speaking again very speculatively here, but and I'm also thinking there's probably a lineage. Since we've been talking about Western versus other terminologies, I'm thinking about the way in which these practices often are mixing East and West. So there's Buddhist meditation practice that's coming through Western lenses. And then there's also a relation to something like, and a lot of traditions have a word for energy. So qi is a Chinese word that has been adapted into English contexts. Also notions of kind of energetic channels coming from Hindu or Indian contexts. Ashe, which is energy in a African context. So maybe we appropriate, because English doesn't have a good terminology for this. I don't know if German does or not, but it would be like animacy, right? Like something that's animated or has an energy or an aliveness to it. This is where new materialisms that talk about vitalism are important. So are there ways that we can tap into resource or energy that we have as living beings that are taken from us by capitalism, where we think energy or might comes from a form of extractive resource? So I think that's something for us to think about, and think about ways in which our energy has been taken from us and sometimes denied that we even have it. And so these practices I'm talking about are ways to acknowledge, like, even in our fatigue, we have a kind of energy, like we have a right to our fatigue, let's say. So this is again where I think we come upon some very different understandings of political movements, but ones that can also overlap with, a left politics that has been designed to respond to capitalism. Again, I would take us back to my Orthodox training in Marx and Capital, which has everything to do with energetics and industrialization. So I'm not rejecting that lineage. Okay, there was one other point I wanted to make, but it's not coming to me right now. But definitely we can. This is kind of an interesting place. Like, I didn't know we were going to get here to this idea of energetics and I don't know, a politics of rest. But I think it's really interesting.
So I think there's one more question. Is this the raising hand? Yeah. So
maybe that's
let's take this.
The final
just one last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
So yeah, I also don't think it's a question, right? It's more in addition, like this terminology about it, because what came to my mind quite early was the term learned helplessness, which is used in psychology a lot when it comes to depression. And I think it's might be a term that quite useful if you want to talk about like the idea of power taken away from us and how we can see it through that lens that people who experience it, like oppression and stuff like that, have a lot this experience of I don't have power in the world, and what I can do to counteract that is find spaces and find places in the world where I can experience myself as powerful. And I think the German word would be like Handlungsmöglichkeiten. So
Agency.
yeah, agency. Where do I have agency? Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if we would talk about helplessness. And again, we'd have to do some translation back and forth because you're right, it is a like a technical term that's used clinically, this idea of learned helplessness. Then it's interesting to think about it in relation to agency. I'm not against that, but I think I would just add, building off of the points that I was just making, that this idea of energetics maybe is less tied to individualist notions of agency. And I think this is, I'm remembering now where I wanted to go in response to that previous comment, that that if we think about energetics and mood, right? Because we're talking about a mood of powerlessness or helplessness, then the answer doesn't lie just in individual notions of agency, but it is something more collective or energetic, and doesn't necessarily require resource in the conventional way. So this is where, again, the queer stuff helps us with this non-normative sense of what does power or what does agency look like. That's where I also was wanting to go to with why I find useful resources like Octavia Butler and traditions of Black radical thought and action, because that is a place where you see call it agency if you want, or collective action that does not depend on resource in the conventional capitalist or wealth model at all. So to see a tradition whereby people were able to come together with no conventional resource at all, other than the power of their own bodies, and even their bodies were denied to them, right? Like, you know, familial relations were denied, reading was denied, your labor was taken from you. But let us say you had one day off on a Sunday where you could gather in formation to create a church of some kind, or, you know, use your body for purposes of song and dance. That's the lineage that someone like Octavia Butler is drawing from, or that Toshi Regan and her mother, Bernice Johnson Regan, are drawing from. And even if our position as, let's say, white people of middle-class heritage is not the same, I think we need to be learning from each other in order to understand where energy could come from that does not rely on conventional capitalist models of material wealth and extractive industry.
I think that's a wonderful point on this idea of collectivity and community and resistance, and, you know, alternative forms of generating energy, generating momentum and agency as a collective process.
Good. We managed to end on a somewhat positive.
And thank you for the wonderful thoughts. Thank you for your insights. And thank you for joining us again. And thank you to the audience. Thank you for the wonderful discussion.
And for the collective effort to think about Ohnmacht and how we can deal with it. And hopefully next time in person here in Köln.
Yeah, thank you also for your questions. You know, I think they come from kind of working together on shared projects. And so you made it easy for me. It didn't require a lot of effort. And I hope these ideas continue to circulate. I think too, I like working in conversation where, you know, there is that kind of collective brainstorming. So I feel like you were able to take me to some places I wasn't expecting to go. So I'm grateful for that. All right. See you again in person, I hope, sometime.
See you soon, and hopefully in
Okay.
Prague or at any other conference.
Have fun dancing. Send me the playlist. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.